now here. That is not a tomorrow problem. That is a today problem for India. And one thing I would say is that in the same way that the United States often tries to say to Indian colleagues, like, hey, this wedge strategy that you have with China and Russia is not actually going to work the way that you think. I think Indian counterparts say to the United States, hey, this wedge strategy that you think you're trying to run with Pakistan, between Pakistan and China, is not going to play out in the way that you think. And I do think that the Pakistan relationship with China today is so much further advanced than what it was a decade ago. It behooves the United States to interrogate a little more the degree to which some of the things that Indian colleagues raise as concerns, whether that's tactics, training, and procedures that Pakistan could pick up from Western countries flowing eventually into China, or whether that's inadvertent tech flowing from Pakistan into China. It behooves the United States and other Western countries to actually interrogate those questions a little more.
Would you agree with that, Dr. Liu?
I think that the way we need to think about the India-Pakistan relationship today is the more that India is forced to focus on its border with Pakistan and with both deterring and responding to cross-border attacks coming out of Pakistan, the less bandwidth that it has to focus on what I think most Indian policymakers would tell you is really the more existential strategic threat that they face, and that is the one from China. And so what concerns me about the situation we're in right now is that coming out of May 2025, India is looking at emergency procurements, it is thinking about where it puts its forces, and the more that those are on one border, there are some pretty zero-sum trade-offs with what it can do on the other border. There are also real differences in kinds of force structure and capability it needs to deal with Pakistan versus what it needs to deal with China. And so I think in a lot of ways, Indian policymakers would probably acknowledge that Pakistan is not the existential threat that China is, but it is also a political reality that they can't afford to ignore. And so they have to deal with that near-term situation and get that border more stable in order to be able to focus on Beijing.
I'll just add on the Pakistan-Russia issue. One of the things that India would be deeply concerned about, and has indicated that it would be, is not just Russia moving from neutral to taking China's side in an India-China crisis, but also the coming together of Russia, China, Pakistan. So when we worry here about an axis that involves China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, they worry about, at times they've worried about China, Russia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, less so now because of the Taliban's differences with the Pakistani government. They have worried about China, Russia, North Korea, Pakistan. And so for them, they partly engage, one of the reasons for engaging and maintaining ties with the Russians is to ensure that that China-Russia-Pakistan alignment doesn't come about. China has actively, and the Pakistani leader at the time, Imran Khan, was in Russia the week of the Russian invasion, and he publicly said that that visit was facilitated by the Chinese. This is the kind of thing India worries about, and it's also the kind of thing that Russia actually uses to try to keep India on side.
Thank you.
Commissioner Slevin.
Thank you, and thanks to our witnesses. I'd like to pick up on Commissioner Shmamonian's last questions as well as it relates to the May 2025 conflict, maybe starting with Dr. Lalwani. You alluded to questions that New Delhi is asking since then and maybe certain assumptions that were broken and that the support from the Chinese was material and digital as well. So I invite all the panel to respond, but maybe starting with Dr. Lalwani. Do you see this as having been a more episodic event, responding to a specific set of circumstances, a terrorist attack? Do you see it suggesting more of an aggressive posture on the part of India? And with that, what kinds of questions you think are derived from those questions?
So to the last question about whether it's episodic, I actually think this is a trajectory, but I think the trajectory is on the Chinese side, where you're starting to see greater involvement in picking a side. There were about 25 years ago, China would be following sort of the U.S. lead in terms of calling for de-escalation or ceasefires or mediation in some ways. And I think today we are seeing China more and more putting its thumb on the scale in this conflict. And it goes to the previous question and point, which is that it is in China's interest to see India diverted to the Pakistan border specifically, and so diverted away from not only the northern border with China, but also from the Indian Ocean. So there's a utility to India being quote unquote bogged down or contained within the South Asian subcontinent rather than sort of being a maritime power. I do think in this case it was a stepwise jump in terms of China's involvement. I think all Indian analysts and officials recognize China's materially benefited and enabled Pakistan's military from sort of nuclear technology, enrichment missiles, to now sort of a wide range of advanced military hardware. But I think its active involvement, its live involvement, particularly through radars and sensors and intelligence and even guidance, I think was a surprise to the Indians and presaged something far more challenging in the future that they're trying to prepare for.
I would add, I guess, that, India has often talked about sort of the notion of like a two-front crisis as like the real existential threat that it could potentially face. And I think that post-May 2025, it looks like that is now here. That is not a tomorrow problem. That is a today problem for India. And one thing I would say is that in the same way that the United States often tries to say to Indian colleagues, like, hey, this wedge strategy that you have with China and Russia is not actually going to work the way that you think. I think Indian counterparts say to the United States, hey, this wedge strategy that you think you're trying to run with Pakistan, between Pakistan and China, is not going to play out in the way that you think. And I do think that the Pakistan relationship with China today is so much further advanced than what it was a decade ago. It behooves the United States to interrogate a little more the degree to which some of the things that Indian colleagues raise as concerns, whether that's tactics, training, and procedures that Pakistan could pick up from Western countries flowing eventually into China, or whether that's inadvertent tech flowing from Pakistan into China. It behooves the United States and other Western countries to actually interrogate those questions a little more.
Would you agree with that, Dr. Lalwani?
Absolutely. And I do think that there are certain aspects that we should be asking ourselves and our partners. There's one area where the Indians have pointed out where they believe that the Pakistanis were able, or the Chinese were able to stitch data links between Chinese fighter jets, Swedish AWACS systems, and potentially even U.S. originated ground radars, and that should be a concern to all of us if the Chinese are getting into those data links.
Dr. Madan?
I just add one thing. A dimension that didn't necessarily play out, but could in this crisis, but could in the next, is the naval side. And that is another space where it doesn't get as much attention, but China is actively modernizing Pakistan's naval forces as well, just delivered another submarine to the Pakistanis. And so this will not stay on the continent. It will eventually involve a maritime domain, which also goes to that point that if we want India focusing on China, and we have long argued that, it needs to think about the maritime space, partly because it has certain advantages there, is China will seek to actually impinge on those advantages, but also that the more China can hold India down on the continental side, the less India will be able to do itself in the maritime side. And it's not just a China story there, it's a Pakistan one as well.